Today we're going to talk about the cognitive function stack in Kataronics. And in Kataronics, there's actually no true recipe of how that stack will kind of work its way, right? So the idea of Kataronics is actually kind of that we have the like typical patterns that we see in MBTI and 16 personalities and these kind of theories, but Cataronics kind of, it's not that those ideas are rejected. It's more like how to put it. It's like it's no like in Cataronics. There's no like true recipe for how those patterns will emerge, if that makes sense. So maybe there's atypical types, right? Not only maybe atypical types that doesn't really necessarily fit into one of those 16 categories of patterns. In Cataronics, the focus is actually mostly just to be aware of the eight cognitive functions and be aware that all of those eight cognitive functions are a part of yourself and of others and reality, and that we should integrate a relationship with all of those functions in a way that is conducive to our health, essentially. So the kind of for example, I identify kind of an like an INFP, but more so a transcendent INFP because I don't want to limit myself into that kind of box. But I recognize that like INFP is kind of, I recognize that has been my pattern, that has been my own past pattern, if that makes sense. And it kind of still is, and it kind of still will always be in a way, at least since I came from that background. I will always have the like INFP past experience and past knowledge and evolution that I got out from that experience, if that makes sense. But I'm like Cataronics is less certain of these type patterns to be forever, if that makes sense. Like I think it's possible to develop all the functions and also kind of develop all your personalities in a way, and also possible to even kind of develop yourself in maybe you grew up in an environment that kind of made you more atypical than these, like some kind of between types between these 16 personality types, and I think that is valid as well. That's what kind of Cataronics has a very like open-minded view on this stuff, but at the same time I think like at the same time the like 16 personality types, I think it's common patterns to like it's typical patterns, right? So it's still useful in that sense. Okay, so what the idea is that there's typical paths of least resistance. So these 16 personalities are basically that they're typical paths of least resistance. But then again, maybe you are in a situation where there's another typical path that doesn't really align with those 16 personality type paths, if that makes sense. Okay. So yeah, all eight cognitive functions involved means you are healthy. If you have a healthy relationship with all the cognitive functions, basically you look at all the cognitive function with a sense of, I actually like this function and I want this function in my life and I want to relate with this function in a good way. If you have that with all the eight cognitive functions, that's a very, very good place to start for your health development, essentially. Okay, so but there, like I said, there's still this pattern that I think is typical. So I think it's useful regardless because it's so usual, right? It's So kind of typical to for those behaviors to happen. So I still think I still believe in the 16 personalities. It's just that I don't think they are as static as they usually are presented as, if that makes sense. But I've seen some kind of patterns in that typical pattern that I want to discuss right now. So and it's actually, I think socionics is kind of they are good at kind of this looking also at the shadow functions and how that kind of also has something to say for the personality, if that makes sense. So the demon function is kind of that's what is called in other typologies the demon function, which is for INFP, for example. It's the TI, for example. And I think in Kataronics I kind of called it fallen angel function, but it's more like I don't think it's good to have a negative label on like kind of a function, because it kind of, if you see it like a demon function, you will make it into a demon function, right? So it's more like if you have another perspective on that function, I think you can see it more like you can develop it more correctly, if that makes sense. But there is a typical pattern though to have that like demon relationship, right, with that function. So in that sense, the name actually makes sense, right? And I think for INFPs, for example, I think we have the TI function is our demon function because we basically we are afraid unconsciously that this function will actually depersonalize us, which means we are afraid we're afraid that like understanding this mechanical theoretical pattern, how like understanding of how things actually work, we are afraid unconsciously of this to basically say to us that, oh, the soul is not real, the living essence in ourselves are not real, we are just some kind of construct, right? I think that's the demon behavior in our demon function, if that makes sense. But like at the same time, this, I think we as INFPs, I think we discover that this is just an illusion, and we can learn to integrate this TI function by like, oh, we want to understand things as well, and it doesn't actually remove our soul. It doesn't actually do that. And when we understand that, we can start to develop this function in ourselves. And when we do, maybe that will be a little bit atypical, because an INFP usually doesn't have TI, right? But that's the kind of that's the art of developing yourself and integrating all, like the individuation process that Jung talked about, right? And if you have individuated to a higher degree, you are going to be presented a little bit atypical in a sense. Okay, so the fallen angel function, why do I say that? Well, because it is actually a function that isn't necessarily that bad actually in INFPs. If you look at INFPs, they actually have a kind of a great capacity to do TI, but oftentimes they don't want to do it because they feel like it's basically removes their soul, right? But in actuality, they use TI a lot, especially if it's for the FI reasons. If they wanna, I don't know, maybe they have like this FI vision of making a game, for example. They wanna create this game for FI reasons essentially, but they need the TI for kind of coding the game, like understanding how to you know, make the scripts work, because if you have one logical error in the script, it's not going to work, right? And you actually see a lot of INFPs work in professions like this because their TI isn't actually that bad. It's just that they have a like hate-love relationship with it, and that hate part of that relationship will kind of fade away when the INFP understands that it doesn't actually threaten that introverted feeling function. That's kind of the idea that Kataronics has. So because TI can be like, let's say TI kind of study science and like how those things work and blah blah blah, and they're like, oh, everything is deterministic, everything is already decided, and we don't have any free will, and blah 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 blah. And that could be like correct from one perspective, right? But I think when we use TI and also have integrated the FI function and the feeling function and the intuition function, we will understand that, oh yeah, but there is another part of reality that is actually indeterministic, so it's actually governed by free will, if you will. So it's is this kind of understanding of how do we see all the functions without kind of excluding some functions, because that's often what happens, right? If you didn't integrate all of these shadows, you will exclude those shadows, and then it doesn't look like it's a part of the real deal, if that makes sense. And you will find a kind of truth that doesn't really have the truth of everything, but like in a little pocket kind of thing. So in the free will example, for example, I think actually the sensory world is where things doesn't have free will, while in the quantum world or the intuition world is actually where free will emerges from. But free will is very important for FI, I believe, because we wanna like create our own kind of world with our like subjective self, right? We want to have an impact on life, and we want to look at ourselves as kind of creative beings that can express our and figure out who we really are, if that makes sense. So we usually don't see that as something that is predetermined, if that makes sense. Like FINE doesn't really like to think that things are predetermined. Okay, so we also have the demonstrative function, which also is borrowed from socionics. And I believe I've seen that tendency very strongly myself. Like for example in INFJs, you can see how this demonstrative functions, which is FI, right? So we have the FE and the FI. They are very like interconnected in the INFJ if we really look at it. But they can be, if not super integrated, then they can be more not friend with the FI function in themselves, and kind of lack this ability to love themselves and so forth. And maybe they look at FI and they mistake it for being something selfish or arrogant or non-loving in a way. Yeah. So the thing is, like, in the INFJ, you often see this FI function is very strongly expressed. I think at least everyone who has FI as a dominant function can easily like identify like these INFJs and ISFJs are very strongly expressive in their FI function. Like they come with this moral hammer and stuff like that, which actually we wouldn't do as FI heroes usually, because we have more of a control over our feelings, and we know that maybe we should forgive them more than judge them, for example. So it's just that the INFJ have to understand what is FI and how do I healthily relate with it. What is actually like the true healthy version of FI, rather than having the wrong idea of what it is. Because I think that's what causes that kind of sometimes weird dynamic in the demonstrative function. Yeah, so it's like it's a function we usually don't like because it causes problems for us in our life, but also it's the correct understanding of that function that really solves that problem in the first place, right? So I think that's you see that kind of you can see that did the individual integrate that demonstrative function, or did they not? Because it's so strong, it's so like it wants to express all the time. It's like we don't really have any control over it, right? It's kind of like it's there. The individual itself can pretend it's not there, but it's there and everyone can see it, right? And we have the inferior function, which is actually, it's kind of the weakest function. Kataronics is not disagreeing with that idea, but it looks like to Kataronics that this function is it's very strong in this like very limited area, or sometimes, or like it's not like all the time. It's rarely at all, right? But sometimes it suddenly goes like online and knows exactly what to do, if that makes sense. It's like we have a talent in our inferior function sometimes, and then but we can't do it for a long time, if that makes sense. I think that is also a pattern that has been like observed essentially. But just consider that for yourself. And the thing is, if we call it the inferior function, maybe that is bad because maybe people apply this nocebo effect to their inferior function. I think it's good to be realistic that, oh, I'm actually weak in this function. I think that's a good thing to do, but it's also not a good thing to do to let it stay like that, because the only way to actually make it a little bit stronger is that you have to, as they often say, fake it till you make it, right? So you have to kind of believe a little bit in your inferior function a little bit more than you did before, and kind of make it better in that way. And you have to treat it like a child essentially, because it's not very good. But you have to also kind of like you would treat a child, you would be happy for just a little bit kind of improvement there, rather than going in this grip mode and being too harsh on yourself and all that stuff. So that's kind of the correct attitude to your inferior function in Kataronics. And another thing about the inferior function is that we are so aware of it being our weakness that we hold. Like we are so like, I'm so bad in this, and we kind of know we are bad in this, and we focus, in a way, according to Kataronics, we focus too much on that weakness, to the extent that we forget to develop our other functions in ourselves that maybe could be easier to kind of develop, if that makes sense. So we're kind of blinded by how weak we are in something, rather than fixing what we could be more capable on fixing, if that makes sense. So the thing is, if I'm, for example, an INFP, maybe I want to look more at my introverted sensing and do things to make that more healthy than I would do with the extroverted intuition. Of course, still not neglect the extroverted thinking, sorry, but like, if I could see introverted sensing, I could do some work here rather than just neglecting that function because I forget that it's also a weakness of mine. Or maybe even the extroverted sensing, which is maybe the real weakness of an INFP, which they are like not aware of at all. So also just not forget that function in a way. And also the TI function, for instance, which maybe is actually maybe easier to develop than your extroverted thinking as an INFP. So kind of we kind of have to just not forget everything we are a little bit weak in, because we only see our weakness. Because at least in INFPs, I feel like they are very aware of their weaknesses, but like they only see their weaknesses, right? Which is not good. You have to also be able to see your strengths, and actually that goes for NFs overall. I think NFs have to realize that they are not because society is like it is, maybe even our dominant functions, feeling and intuition, is not really that developed because uh, we are thought to believe that those functions are not even real or essential to reality, right? Which actually they are. So it's also a point for NFs in idealists to develop their more core functions, because again, I think we underdevelop those functions because we don't believe they are real, if that makes sense. So look also upon that. You can look my feeling and intuition videos for more information on that. And we also have the child trickster paradox, which is that if you have an ENTP, for example, this is just another pattern that I've kind of identified in Kataronics, is that the child trickster paradox is that the ENTP will, for example, have a child extroverted feeling, right? So they're good in feeling, but it's mostly only the extroverted feeling part. So oftentimes they ignore their introverted feeling parts like completely, so they are not very good at that part. And what that does is like, which is a very interesting insights when you think about MBTI stuff, because that basically essentially means that extroverted feelers will look at the ENTP and he will appear like a feeler, if that makes sense, because they recognize that extroverted feeling is there. But the introverted feeler, when they look at ENTPs, they will be like, what? This is not a feeler at all, because we recognize more easily the introverted feeling. And it's like we don't see, we kind of just we see the introverted feeling is not there in the ENTP. So we feel like they are maximum thinkers, right? They don't have feeling awareness whatsoever in a way. That's kind of what it's easy to think for an FI person, especially if that ENTP didn't integrate any not so much feeling, especially not introverted feeling, because it's actually hard for us to identify our blind spot. It's kind of the hardest function to realize even exists. So and if you don't know it exists, you can't really develop it. But I think when we are aware of our blind spot function, we are able to all of a sudden develop that function. And if the ENTP understands that he neglected and didn't see introverted feeling at all, I think he will have very, very much more capacity to actually develop that function. He just has to understand he didn't see it, and then understand what it is, and then how to develop it, essentially. And for just some other examples, for example, the ISFP will look to an NE user. He will look like basically not intuitive at all. But for an NI user, they will actually have some. They will actually seem a little bit intuitive because they have this NI child, right? So it's just another example. You can make more examples yourself in your head and see that this trickster paradox is actually kind of true, and it helps us also when we want to type people. The last one is like kind of inspired a little bit from OPS, because OPS they look on the hero function as kind of flawed, because they have this inferior function kind of making them flawed, and that is true in a way. So if you want to, but it's not true in all ways. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. Like if you have FI as your hero function, you're good at introverted feeling, but the downside is that you don't really see the connection very well between introverted feeling and thinking, or let's say feeling and thinking actually. So the INFP won't see the connection between feeling and thinking very well, while another personality, like the ENFP or INFJ, they will kind of, since they have this middle stack, they don't have feeling as the top hero function. They have feeling as the auxiliary. So it's like they can easier see what is between feeling the heart and thinking the brain. They can see what is between the heart and the brain, right? While an INFP or an ENFJ, for example, they can more like they can see what is in the heart, but they struggle, like they have this hero delusion, as they call it, is that if I'm hero in my heart, maybe I'm delusional about what the brain is. And if you are hero, if you're in your brain, maybe you are delusional about what the heart is. But if you have them in the middle stacks, you're more easily to see what is between the heart and the brain. But the downside of that is that you don't see everything in the brain and you don't see everything in the heart. You just see what the brain, what is between the brain and the heart, what is that fundamental nature. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. So it kind of just makes it easier to think about how these things work, essentially. Okay, so that's the function stack discoveries that Kataronics made, even though there is no really true recipe of how a personality type will play out in Kataronics. But in the typical sense, that is kind of something Kataronics has identified.